So the injury conversation is obviously something I've dedicated a tremendous amount of time to and has really become the focal point of my work. So we gotta clear this up by starting here first. There are two polarized camps on this. Either we can, completely prevent and prohibit any injuries from occurring. Usually it's by doing system X, Y, or Z, and we'll absolve injury potential entirely. That's obviously wrong and short-sighted. But there's also an equal but opposite, incorrect way of looking at this, where particularly in the strength and conditioning community, we just look at it as being this completely, um, happenstantial thing that we have zero influence over, and it's just a byproduct of sport. And no matter what we do, injuries are going to occur. And it's really important to understand that both of those are incorrect. If we think about this first and foremost as a situation of probability rather than prevention, think about it from a statistical analog where we have all of these contributing factors, all these extraneous factors that are all coming together to produce some probability of whether or not this player may or may not experience an injury. So this is a seriously lengthy conversation. And when we talk about the variables or the extraneous factors that are involved, you really can't get a big enough whiteboard or a big enough sheet of paper to list this all out. But going back to this central philosophy or probability, if we do the right training inputs, we couple that with the right therapeutic approaches, we sleep 8 hours a night, we eat good quality food from good sources with the correct caloric intakes, and we have a good health hygiene practice, all these different things, then we are going to fundamentally reduce the probability that an injury is going to occur if we compare that to the same exact athlete who eats like shit, who doesn't sleep beyond 5 hours a night, who trains when they feel like it, and they never do any kind of recovery modalities. So I think no matter what side of the spectrum you sit on this, I think that's a pretty easy thing to come into agreement to. In that if we theoretically take the same person, do all the right things or do all the wrong things, the probability changes for what their likelihood of incurring an injury is. So now I'd say all of that as a preface to come back to, well, why aren't injuries random? Injuries aren't random in the fact that when we retroactively go back and analyze these predominant factors or variables that go into injury occurrence or incidence, in almost every case, we can look at these different variables and say, okay, well, let's look at the workload. And, we see these massive changes in workload or this rapid uptick or this complete drop off, within the last month preceding the injury. That's something that is going to give us pretty clear evidence that the injury maybe didn't occur because of that directly, but it was a large contributing factor to that injury occurring. We can do the same thing with health habits. We can do the same thing with strength training. We can do the same thing with the recovery protocols. So now bringing this into more of a tangible construct, the way that we organize this or the way that we look at it is of these literally thousands of different variables that are floating and play some level of contribution in this. We've boiled it down to four primary things. We have our state, our traits, our workload, and our mechanical factors. So when we're talking particularly about non-contact soft tissue injuries, virtually any of them can really be understood through these four different variables or lenses. So let's start with state. How did you sleep? What's your energy level? What's your pain level? What's your stress level? We can take HRV into consideration in this, but effectively this is just the current state that we are in. We think about this from a training perspective. What are the states that the athletes are in across time periods? And then what are we doing corresponding to these different states? How are we adjusting programming or training prescriptions based on these? And is there a good alignment to those? So the state is the most acute factor, arguably the most important, and it's the one that kind of has the most direct trade-off. Low night of sleep, stress and pain are high, we need to make adjustments on training. Then we have workload. I know I said traits second previously, but we'll come back around to that. Workload, as I kind of already alluded to, is a major driver of injury incidence and occurrence. Now, we've heard a lot about acute chronic workload ratio and other, systemized or formulaic ways that we can track and analyze this. But to be honest, all of those still are somewhat incomplete. So I don't think that there's any pretty little script that we can just deliberately insert into our training setting or in our sports setting and say, okay, now we've got workload covered. It's automated based off of this. There's still an individual factor. There's still a context or a relativity of sport factor. But to get the point across here, rapid, unpredicted change or unplanned changes in workload is a massive driver for increasing the risk or likelihood of a soft tissue injury. So the goal with this is to understand the base condition that an athlete is in or what they've done over the course of a period of time, 1 month to 3 months to a year, and then comparing that with this more acute prescription or application of workload. And all we really need to take away from this is we want to just reduce the peaks and the valleys. We don't want to be super high at any point unless it's planned, and we don't want to be super low at any point unless it's planned. And yes, that includes rest time. With rest time, we don't want to just do nothing, right? Try to lower that amount of valley that we're getting and try to keep them in this range of getting a little bit higher and a little bit lower, but not topping out or peaking out, peaking or bottoming out. Then we go into the mechanical factors. The mechanical factors are essentially how the neuromuscular profile looks, how the muscle tendon unit or junction is functioning, the CNS readiness. And this is almost a pseudo or a proxy measure for the readiness for the athlete to experience or to execute high stress, high demand situation. So force plates are the easiest way to look at this, right? And there's a lot of depth to force plate, but as it applies to this, we can use the force plates as a proxy for, day-to-day readiness and response. It's not an acute driver. So if we have one bad day on force plates, it doesn't mean that the day is gone to shit. We, can't do anything. But what we get more importantly with force plate data is a trend line of how athletes are responding to training, stimulus, load, et cetera, et cetera. So this gives us a deeper indication of the neuromuscular profile. We can look more closely at functional asymmetries, and then we can see if there are any dramatic changes in how the athlete is producing or responding to forces over time. Now, finally, we have traits. This, in my opinion, is the most important factor. And the way that we analyze traits is we look at this as the relative component that provides a subjective background of who the athlete is as it relates to those other three factors. So to give you a very simple example of this, if two athletes have a right ACL injury and a left ankle sprain injury history, those two athletes, based on who they are, what sports they play, how old they are, where they're at in their career, on and on and on, are not going to have the exact same result of those injuries. And they are not going to be compromised or perhaps have the same compensatory strategies based on those two injuries. So we know the number one predictor for previous soft tissue injury, the number one predictor for soft tissue injury occurrence is previous soft tissue injury. And the more injured in number and in complexity or degree that an athlete has, the more likely they are to sustain an injury moving forward. So the injury history piece tells us an abundance of information, but it doesn't tell the full picture. The full picture is how that injury history exists adjacent to the archetype or the movement signatures of the athlete. So we hear people talk all the time about force-based or elastic-based athletes. And I think that's obviously an oversimplification, but it's a perfectly fine way to just broadly organize two different styles of movers, your Ja Morant versus your Zion Williams. That being said, the trait piece is what we factor into the state, the workload, and the mechanical components that we can then relatively understand how this individual athlete is responding to these basic factors for injury occurrence or incidents. So to bring this into a summary, injuries are going to happen. There's absolutely no preventative mechanism unless we just elect to not do anything that may impose danger. That being said, we view injury potential as a probability, not as a binary outcome. We are not going to entirely absolve it, but we also just aren't at the mercy of whatever happens. As human performance practitioners and coaches, we have a direct input and opportunity to change this probability based on the decisions that we make, the applications that we choose, and the inputs that we provide for the athlete along the way. So it's not a randomized outcome. We can definitely look back at a lot of these injuries, most of these injuries, and identify where things probably could have been, buffered or improved, or, potentially have omitted the opportunity for an injury to occur. But we also need to understand that sport is a microcosm of chaos, as is life. So things are going to happen. And we never want to think about it as a complete prevention strategy. We just want to think about it as how can we reduce the probability of an injury occurring.